The Democrats have different proposals for healthcare in this country. Some are proposing Medicare for all. Others are saying we should expand Obamacare. Will any of these solutions actually work? And does the GOP have any better solutions? Well, right now I'm speaking with an expert on this subject, Phil Kerpen, who's the president of American Commitment. And you can go to americancommitment.org to find out more information on that. And Phil, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started with the subject of healthcare, I did want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do for American Commitment, and, of course, what americancommitment.org is involved in.
Yeah, we are a national free market advocacy group. We work really on all of the fiscal, economic, and regulatory issues, so taxes, spending, healthcare, energy, technology policy, regulatory process, really pretty much everything except foreign policy and social issues. And what we do that's a little bit different from some of the other groups in Washington is we don't do original research. So you're not going to see 20 or 30-page white papers like you would from a Cato or a Heritage. We try to get the facts and the information that's out there and really focus on the things that are on the margin, where a little bit of involvement can make a difference, where a economic issue might go either direction. Then we try to get people the facts and the information they need to be more effective, more active, engaged citizens on these issues in the form of 200 or 300-word action alert emails or 600-word columns, sometimes short videos. The whole thing is geared towards making it easier for people to know what's happening on these issues and to do something about it. And so we've got lots of action items on our website in the Action Center, form letters into Congress or regulatory agencies or the administration. We just try to make it really easy for people to follow these issues and to be active on them. And all of the information is on our website at americancommitment.org.
And I understand you're on Twitter as well, pretty active on Twitter.
Yes, we have an organizational account which just kind of puts our articles out and that kind of thing. If you type in American Commitment, you can find that. And then I'm personally a little bit of a Twitter addict myself, and mine is my last name, Kerpen, Kerpen. I had a lot of Mets tweets when they were on that winning streak. They're on a losing streak now, so it's not as much that, but there's also a lot of policy and political stuff on there as well.
I understand that. So the biggest, one of the biggest issues right now, especially when you're talking about between the Democrats who are trying to get the nomination for the Democrat presidential nomination, is health care. And it seems that there's sort of a split in the Democrat Party. Some want Medicare for all, and others want to expand Obamacare. Where do you see all this heading?
Well, the interesting thing to me is not so much the disagreement, which I think has been really focused on a lot by the media and the way they cover everything. But the remarkable thing to me, as kind of an outside observer, as a conservative looking at the Democratic debates, is how much they really agree on health care and how much they really sort of all share the same goal. I think pretty much every Democrat running for president, maybe with the exception of John Delaney from Maryland, but his chances are about the same as mine of getting the nomination. Pretty much every Democrat up there wants us to be eventually in the system where there's no private insurance and everyone is in a government plan and all the decisions are made by politicians and bureaucrats. And the disagreement really is over how fast to get there, how directly to get there, and how honest to be about it with the American people. And you've got sort of the hardcore out and proud socialists, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, saying, hey, ban all private insurance immediately, force everyone into a government plan. Depending on the day of the week, Kamala Harris is sometimes in that camp as well. She's flipped back and forth, 6 or 7 times at this point. And then kind of on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Joe Biden saying, no, don't do that. We should only have a choice of Medicare if people want it, but if they want, they should be able to stay in their private insurance, and we need to build on Obamacare. And he's actually using the Obama lines, literally. I mean, now, of course, Biden is known for plagiarizing campaign speeches, so we shouldn't be surprised. But he's out there literally saying, if you like your plan, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep it. I mean, the most infamous Democratic lie about health care ever, and he's dusting it off and putting it right in the stump speech. And, of course, if you kind of look at the implications of what he's saying, if you offer unsubsidized Medicare buy-in as an alternative to private insurance, no one would buy it because it would be more expensive. Medicare spends over $1,400 per individual on a monthly basis. Obamacare plans are significantly less expensive than that. They're more comprehensive than that. So if it's unsubsidized, it really wouldn't appeal to anyone. Of course, it wouldn't be unsubsidized. It would be heavily subsidized, and the idea would be that you would have heavily taxed and regulated private plans, heavily subsidized public plan, and eventually employers would all drop their coverage. Everyone would end up in the government plan, and you're sort of on the slow road to the same place that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren want to go to, on the fast road. And so I think the disagreement among Democrats is, as I said, it's really about how fast to get there and how honest to be about it. And Biden is taking the extraordinarily dishonest route of repeating, if you like your plan, you can keep it, when his policy really is just a slower path, perhaps a path less likely to spur a political backlash, but that still ends in the same place of eventually having everyone in a government plan.
Do you feel like that was the goal of Obamacare originally, was to take us in that direction?
I think it was certainly a goal of some of Obamacare's supporters. I think that it's probably an exaggeration to say everyone behind Obamacare wanted that. I think there were certainly some people who supported and designed Obamacare that thought it would actually work, and of course they were wrong. But I do think that there was a significant portion of Democrats who thought, look, this is a way we can sort of wreck the private insurance system and then say, hey, it didn't work, let's just put everyone in a government plan. And in particular, this policy that Biden is now proposing of having a government-run plan or a public option that would compete with private insurance, that was a major element of all of the draft versions of Obamacare. It ended up not passing because they came up a couple of votes short on that part of it. Some Democrats who ended up being skeptical of that in the Senate, and it ended up coming out. But back during that debate, the 2009 debate, there was a Yale professor named Jacob Hacker who said that we should have this public option, and then over time the private plans will be crippled, and everyone will end up in the government plan, and that'll be kind of the way to do it. Sort of a politically attainable path to a single-payer system, and they took that out, which made it a little bit less obvious, sort of what the glide path would be from Obamacare to single-payer when they didn't have the government plan in the bill anymore. Nonetheless, I think that the fact that just 10 years after Obamacare passed, we're talking about the Democrats who want to put everyone in a government-run single-payer system is pretty good evidence that at least among them, people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, when they were looking at Obamacare, they saw it as precisely what you said, as a path to get to the single-payer government-run system they wanted. And here they are just a decade later saying, hey, basically Obamacare didn't work. Let's go ahead and put everyone directly in a government plan. And so I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist and say it was all plotted and planned this way, because I do think there were certainly some supporters of Obamacare who thought it would work and wanted it to work. But it's pretty hard to look at where we are right now, just 10 years after Obamacare passed, and not conclude that at least some of its supporters wanted and expected it to fail and saw that as a step toward their goal of single-payer health care.
I'm speaking with Phil Kerpen. He is the president of American Commitment. You can go to americancommitment.org to find out more information. Earlier you said the Democrats are basically admitting that Obamacare was a failure, and you believe Obamacare was a failure. Why did it fail?
Well, I think there are several reasons that it failed, but the most significant one is that the regulatory model doesn't allow differentiation between low utilizers of healthcare and high utilizers of healthcare. And what I mean by that is that if you're an extremely healthy person that almost never goes to the doctor, and when you do, it's just a checkup and that kind of thing, under the old pre-Obamacare system, you could have very, very low premiums because you weren't using very much health care and you were just insuring against a low probability risk of an expensive condition developing. Under Obamacare, because of the model they used for the pre-existing condition problem, everyone has to be charged the same amount, regardless of your utilization. And so we've got the vast majority of the U.S. population that uses very little health care saw a huge increase in their premiums and their costs because they've got to be charged the same as the sickest people who are massive consumers of health care. And a much better approach to the problem, in my opinion, would have been to say, look, let's just subsidize the people who are commercially uninsurable, who have uninsurable pre-existing conditions. Let's do it directly, give them the assistance. It would have been much less expensive than Obamacare, and we didn't really need to turn the health arrangements for the whole rest of the country upside down to help that relatively small group of people. But I think that that regulatory approach, that centerpiece, that heart of Obamacare that said everyone's going to be charged the same, whether you use a lot of health care or almost none, that's been a massive driver in the cost of premiums for healthy people who use very little health care and should be paying, therefore, very little, but cannot under the Obamacare model. Then on top of that, we've got the plan design issue, and this is the problem that every health plan in the country now has to have a benefit package that basically was designed by federal bureaucrats with hundreds of pages of specification. Congress just had 10 broad categories that they mandated be covered. They're called essential health benefits, and even that's problematic because things like maternity and infant care that are very, very expensive now have to be in every single plan. There's no possibility, even if, say, you're a single man or an elderly post-fertility couple that has no chance of having a baby, you can't buy a plan that doesn't cover that, and that's a major driver of cost. But but beyond that 10 categories that Congress put in, HHS wrote hundreds of pages of detailed regulations of what every plan has to cover in the country, and it's pretty comprehensive, and therefore all of the plans are very expensive, even if you might prefer something less comprehensive and less expensive. That choice generally is not available in Obamacare. The Trump administration has brought back what they call short-term limited duration insurance that can be less comprehensive and is much less expensive. That's one of the deregulatory things they're doing. But in terms of why Obamacare failed, I really think the regulatory model was far too expensive, especially for healthy people, and has far too little meaningful choice and flexibility because in many places there's only one or two insurance companies participating, but even where there are several, the plans all look pretty much the same, and they cost similar amounts and typically very high prices because of how comprehensive they're required to be.
I'm speaking with Phil Kerpen. He is the president of American Commitment. You can find out more information on that organization by going to americancommitment.org. When we get back, I'm going to ask Phil, what is the right solution then in terms of how to cut healthcare costs down in this country? And we'll also discuss other things going on in the world, including this ongoing trade dispute between Trump and China. I'm speaking with Phil Kerpen, who is the president of AmericanCommitment.org. And we've been discussing healthcare. It's a big issue right now, especially when you look at the presidential race. The Democrats who are running for the primary right now, running in the primaries right now, they see it as one of their biggest issues. Some are pushing Medicare for all. Others, as we discussed, want sort of an expansion of Obamacare that kind of takes us in the direction of Medicare for all, but doesn't get us there right away. But the real question is, does the GOP have a better solution? And is there a way, a free market way, maybe, to cut healthcare costs in this country? So, Phil, that's what I wanted to start out with. Do you guys at American Commitment talk about what the actual solution to high healthcare costs in this country would be?
Yeah, I think that, obviously it was a devastating failure that Republicans didn't get a health care bill done when they controlled the House, Senate, and White House. They did repeal, I think, the most important thing to get repealed, which was the individual mandate, and they did that in the tax reform bill. And by repealing the individual mandate, they basically said, Obamacare is no longer mandatory, it's now voluntary, and if you make health arrangements other than Obamacare by some different type of insurance, you will not be penalized for making that choice, for making that decision, which created the space for a lot of the deregulatory efforts we've seen subsequently in the Trump administration. They've made available things like association health plans, short-term limited duration insurance. They're now bringing back health reimbursement arrangements, which let employers offer pre-tax dollars to their employees to purchase their own health insurance. And so we're starting to see movement in the direction that I think conservatives should want to see in terms of bringing lower cost options, other choices back, making them available, and they can do that without penalty because of what Congress did accomplish. That said, there's a lot more that can be done and needs to be done if Republicans are fortunate enough to win back the House. And I start with what we were very, very close to doing in September of 2017, and that was the bill that Lindsey Graham put together with Bill Cassidy, and that bill, for the first time, really united conservatives who have never been able to agree on health care because there's so many different ideas and models and proposals from conservatives, which was one of the reasons that we failed to do anything on health care for so many years and created kind of the opportunity for Democrats to seize the issue and pass Obamacare in the first place. And the key insight behind Lindsey Graham's bill was, look, let's not try to solve this problem in Washington. Let's take all of the money and all of the regulatory power and block grant it to the states and have this debate in 50 state capitals instead of in Washington, D.C., and, some of them will do things we don't like, I'm sure, but some of them will do things that will give people more meaningful choice and competition, allow them to get more affordable plans and, more, other options that work for themselves and their families, and then those will serve as a model for other states to create more political pressure and momentum and so forth. And I will never know. But I think that had Thad Cochran not been medically absent and sick and stuck in Mississippi, that bill probably would have passed because Rand Paul was a public no, but I think if they'd actually been able to have the vote and he'd been the deciding vote, I think he would have ended up voting for it and it would have passed. We'll never know now. But that, I think, is the starting point for where we need to go and what we can do if we have Republican control again. And there's been a lot more work done since then. And one of the problems was it was so rushed because they were trying to meet that end of September 2017 deadline to get that done. But there's been a lot of work done to further refine and develop that block grant proposal since then by the Galen Institute and the Heritage Foundation in particular, and Rick Santorum and others. And I think they now call it the Health Care Choices Proposal, and I think that's kind of the developing consensus Republican position on how to fix health care. And what the current version of it does that is such a big improvement is instead of just block granting all of the money and power to the states, which, we got a lot of pushback from people in California. I got some members of Congress from California who called me and said this does nothing for me and my constituents. Sacramento would be even worse than Washington, and I was sympathetic to that. They were probably right. What this version does that I think is so brilliant is it says we're going to block grant the money and the power to the states. However, there is a requirement that if an individual does not want to participate in the state program, they can get the money in the form of an individual voucher to purchase any health insurance that they wish. And so it's in effect, it voucherizes at the individual level the individual allotment as an alternative to the block grant that the states establish, and that gives an option to people even in liberal states who otherwise might be stuck. And so I think that we've seen a lot of really good work done. And the sort of the key insight is get the money and the decision-making power out of Washington, get it to the states, get it to individuals, get it to families. And if we do that, we'll have a functioning market, and you'll have lower-cost plans come on the market, and arrangements like direct primary care that don't even rely on insurance. And you'll see that because people will control the purchasing power, and they will have the money will then create the incentive for providers, insurance companies, and medical providers themselves directly to innovate and to come up with business models that are more affordable and provide better care and choices that work for people and their families. And so I think that's really the model and the vision that we want to move towards. And I just really hope that if Republicans should be fortunate enough to find themselves either after this next election or the one after that or the one after that to again have the presidency, the House, and the Senate, that they know they must deliver on health care, that failure to get that done really was devastating and dispiriting to the conservative base and was, I think, a major contributor to the Democrats taking the House in 2018.
Now, I noticed there you mentioned the word market a few times, a healthcare market, but I also noticed a lot of Democrats and a lot of those on the left, they believe that a market for healthcare just doesn't work, and they always point to Europe or Canada saying, well, they have nationalized health care in those countries, and it works. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think, a lot of what they point to are statistics that I think are inaccurate or deceptive, and in particular, they frequently point to infant mortality statistics and say the United States has higher infant mortality than a lot of these countries, and that difference is really based on the fact that in America, any infant that comes out alive, we treat medically, and we consider a live birth in our statistics, and many of them we're able to save and to cure, the conditions associated with prematurity and birth defects and other things. And we can't cure them all, so some of them die. That goes into our infant mortality rate. Almost all of these European countries do not count high-risk births like that as live births, and so they don't count them in their infant mortality. And so there's this statistical artifact where we look worse because we're actually better, because we actually try. And when you actually try, you sometimes fail. And so our numbers on that look worse. The life expectancy numbers, which you see a lot of, the reason that we do worse than a lot of these European countries is principally there are two major factors behind that, neither of which has anything to do with the healthcare system. One is that we drive so many more vehicle miles because we're such a bigger country with less dense land use in so many parts of it. We drive so many more vehicle miles that we have many, many more automotive deaths, and many of them are at relatively young ages, and so that affects our life expectancy. That has nothing to do with our healthcare system. And we also have higher rates of violent crime, unfortunately, than many of these European countries, and that has a major impact on those statistics. But if you correct for the differences in vehicle miles traveled and the crime rates, we actually would have higher life expectancy than the European countries. So a lot of what you see is kind of a statistical mirage. If you look at things like survival rates of diseases, cancer survival rates in particular, we do much better than these countries. We're actually the best in the world. And I think that if you look at sort of the direct measures of healthcare quality, rather than some of these statistical things that can be misleading, we do very, very well. We're at or near the top in almost all of those measures. And the challenges that the socialized government-run systems have are they have a chronic shortage of providers because they have government-run systems with limitations, price controls, and so forth. That causes supply shortages, and they therefore have very lengthy waiting lists. In Canada, you can wait 6 to 8 months for an MRI in some circumstances. It can be very difficult to get in to see a specialist. That's why you see people of means, wealthier people in Canada and Europe often come to the United States and pay out of pocket so that they can skip those waiting lists, skip those queues. And so it's not all positives in these government-run systems. In particular, they have chronic shortages, and sometimes they manipulate the statistics in
Right.
Pretty outrageous ways. In the United Kingdom, they have a law now that limits how long you can wait for treatment in an emergency room because the waits were so outrageous. But to get around that, they now keep people who go to the hospital for an emergency, they keep them in the ambulance.
I've been speaking with Phil Kerpen. He's the president of American Commitment. You want to find out more information on them, just go to americancommitment.org. We've been talking healthcare policy and other politics, and I really appreciate Phil coming on the show. I'm speaking with Phil Kerpen, who's the president of americancommitment.org. We've been discussing politics and the healthcare debate. But in a moment, we are going to discuss the trade dispute between the Trump administration and China. And, of course, the Democrats have been blasting Trump over that as well. But, Phil, I wanted to give you an opportunity. In the last segment, we were talking about how a lot of Democrats will point to Europe, will point to Canada and say that healthcare system works. Why can't we have a healthcare system like they do, a nationalized healthcare system? But you were pointing out some of the flaws in that thinking, and specifically what's going on in the UK right now, because they are having problems with their national healthcare system.
Yeah, they have major challenges. They have major waiting lists. Emergency room overcrowding, in particular, as I mentioned, has been a huge problem. They tried to legislate it away. Of course, that doesn't work. Now they have people in the parking ramps in the ambulances waiting hours before they go into the emergency room, so they can stay under, I think, their 4-hour wait inside the emergency room. And just one last thought on this whole international question. I think to the extent some of these foreign systems work, or can be said to work, and I do think they have many challenges. It's largely because they free ride on our medical innovation. It's the United States where you can earn a return on investment that justifies the billions of dollars to develop a new drug, to develop a new medical device, to develop a new procedure. And the price controls inherent in government-run systems in the rest of the world mean that they cover the marginal cost, but they don't cover the billions of dollars of R&D that it takes to innovate and to develop new cures and to, make life better. We're really paying for all of that, and it's outrageous in a sense that they free ride in that way, and that's of course been a focus of the administrations in their trade negotiations. But the danger, if we follow them, if we do what they do and have government sort of price controls, government-controlled system globally, is innovation could really fall off a cliff. And instead of being one place that the rest of the world gets a free ride on in terms of innovation, innovation could really stall out. And that would be a real tragedy if we stop curing diseases at the rate that we have been. And it would also be a fiscal disaster if, for instance, government policy, kind of clamping down, getting rid of kind of the market returns that are possible. If it means we don't cure cancer or don't cure Alzheimer's or something like that, that's also a fiscal disaster because long-term care and chronic treatment is much more expensive than a cure. And so the incentives to innovate and to cure are a really important factor that we get right in large part, and these other countries get wrong, but they're able to get by because they free ride off of us.
And speaking of our relationship with other countries, right now it's been kind of a back and forth between the Trump administration, President Trump, and China when it comes to trade. It seems like we might have a trade deal, and then we're not going to have a trade deal, and we have more tariffs, and then China says, oh, we're willing to talk again. Where do you see all this going, and do you support what President Trump is doing here?
Well, this is the big one, economically and therefore politically. This is kind of the dominant issue, I think, that we're going to be dealing with, for the next year at least, perhaps several years. And, the president was right to identify the problem. And China is a flagrant abuser of intellectual property rights. They steal hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. Patents and copyrighted goods. They force technology transfers. They violate a lot of the sort of rules of the road of international trade and commerce, and they've done so chronically and with impunity. And the president has basically said, look, unless we get an agreement that ends these abuses, we're going to put major impediments in the form of tariffs on U.S. trade with China and cause severe economic pain for China to gain leverage to get an agreement. The problem is that to impose severe economic pain on China with tariffs also imposes pain on ourselves and raises prices for consumers, and therefore is a big negative for financial markets and puts a lot of uncertainty on U.S. business. And so we're in this struggle now where we're trying to get a favorable outcome. And, if we do get a favorable resolution and China stops stealing hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. intellectual property, then we'll be able to say, hey, it was worth it. The president really accomplished something incredible. The danger, of course, is that China looks at the situation and says, why should we make a deal when we could have a new president in a year who will just call off the tariffs and we'll be back to business as usual the way we always have been, and we can withstand more economic pain than you because we don't have elections, because we're a communist authoritarian regime, and even if there's mass civil unrest, we can just crack down and kind of weather the storm and then get back to business as usual. And so I think that's the big challenge that we have right now, and I do think that China is suffering much more economically than we are as a consequence of the trade war because they are much more trade dependent as an economy than we are. But there's no question that the tariffs and the sort of trade-related uncertainty has been a big negative for the U.S. economy. Look, I mean, we should be absolutely booming right now. We have great tax policy. We have great regulatory policy. We should be totally booming right now, and we're not. We're sort of treading water economically right now, and we maybe are potentially on the edge of a recession. And I think all of that is related to the trade policy. And the question is, what is our pain tolerance and what is China's pain tolerance? And it's a very, very high-stakes game of poker. It's a multi-trillion-dollar global economy in the middle of the table game of poker. And, I don't want to bet against this president, who's maybe one of the greatest negotiators in the history of the world. That said, when the other side of the table is an authoritarian communist regime, I don't know if you can win. And so that's the question. And I don't know how it plays out, to be honest.
Do you fear that maybe some in Trump's inner circle are just protectionist by nature and just like the idea of permanent tariffs?
Well, I think Peter Navarro does, and I think that President Trump himself is probably sympathetic to that view. But I think a lot of the others in the White House are very much free traders and free market people, in particular Larry Kudlow. So he's got, I think, advice coming in both directions on that question. But I think the president, I don't know if the president actually is tariff man who loves tariffs and thinks they're wonderful, or if he thinks that he needs China to think that in order to have leverage in the negotiations. And it's almost impossible from the outside to differentiate the two. So it could be either one, to be honest.
And how do you feel? I mean, are you more on the free trade side of things?
Definitely. I think that free trade's been one of the greatest forces for good in global history. We've lifted literally billions of people out of poverty through free trade and commerce over the last several decades. And just as a matter of basic economics, if you can purchase something from someone else who can produce it more cheaply than you could yourself, then you're generally better off buying it, regardless of whether they're from another country or not. And trade, therefore, tends to be, a positive sum game. That said, it's definitely a negative that China is engaging in wholesale theft of U.S. intellectual property, knocking us off all our stuff with counterfeits and all the rest of the related violations. And so, if you could get China to engage in free trade while playing by the rules rather than stealing things, that would be much more of a positive. But if you end up in a permanent tariff kind of situation, we'll be significantly worse off for it. And so, to me, I'm very concerned about the economic impact that we're seeing right now of the trade policies, but I don't think you can judge them until you see the outcome.
I've been speaking with Phil Kerpen. He's the president of American Commitment. If you want to find out more information on them, go to americancommitment.org. Phil, it's been a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on with me, and we'll get you on again soon.
All right. My pleasure, Michael. Have a good one.